Waking up should never hurt, but that day it did. Every breath felt like a fire burning from the inside out, every heartbeat like a deafening punch to the ribcage. The white ceiling above my head rotated slowly, as if mocking my futile attempt to understand where I was. The strong smell of antiseptic and the low hum of machines gave me my first clue. Hospital. I tried to move my head to look around, but it seemed glued to the pillow. I groaned, a muffled sound that barely came from my dry lips. No one had come. No nurse, no doctor, no anxious relative holding my hand. Just that mechanical silence, cut from time to time by the irregular beeping of some device monitoring my existence. Consciousness returned in pieces, like a jigsaw puzzle put together blindly. Confusing memories came and went before I could grasp them. The accident, the wrong turn, the bright light, the sound of metal tearing metal. Then, nothing. I closed my eyes, trying to organize the chaos in my head. It was impossible. Exhaustion outweighed fear. I let the darkness swallow me up again. When I woke up again, there were voices in the room, hurried, muffled whispers, as if they were discussing something they didn't want me to hear. I struggled to open my eyes. The room was still the same. White walls, hospital smell, machines flashing warm lights. My parents were there. At first, I thought it was a hallucination. They were standing in the corner of the room, half with their backs to me, whispering. My father was gesturing nervously. My mother looked tired, her face rigid, as if she were trapped in a wax mask. I tried to call out to them. I wanted to scream, to move, to do anything to make them realize that I was there, alive. But my body didn't respond. The throat emitted only a weak, ridiculous wheeze. They didn't hear it. They kept talking quietly, too preoccupied with whatever was going on to notice their son lying on the bed like a broken piece of furniture. When they finally turned around, they were already leaving the room. My mother glanced at the bed. For a second, her eyes crossed mine. Then, as if she hadn't seen anything, she took a step closer and disappeared down the corridor. I stood there, immobilized, with a strange chill spreading through my chest. I didn't know what was more frightening, the fact that I was paralyzed, or the feeling that, for them, I no longer existed. The next few hours dragged on pointlessly. Nurses came and went, adjusting devices, checking monitors. None of them spoke to me. None of them even seemed to expect me to be conscious. At first, I tried to communicate my condition by blinking my eyes, moving my fingers. It was like shouting into a dream you can't wake up from. At night, the light from the corridor cast long shadows in the room. I heard distant sounds, footsteps, voices, the metallic creak of stretchers being pushed. I tried to imagine that my parents would come back, that they would hold my hand, that they would say that everything would be all right. But that beautiful image crumbled every time the memory of my mother's blank stare popped into my head. Over the next few days, or weeks, I lost track of time. I began to notice small details that had previously gone unnoticed. The doctors talked about me in the third person, as if I were an object. The patient, the case, bed number 15, they never mentioned my name. And even stranger, they seemed to act as if my recovery wasn't possible. They talked about disconnecting equipment, signing documents, discussing treatment termination options. Termination options. Those words echoed in my mind like funeral bells. I tried to scream again. I tried praying, begging, crying. None of these things work when the body refuses to obey. I spent whole nights watching the slow beat of the heart monitor, each beep confirming that yes, I was still there, trapped inside a broken body that everyone else seemed to have already buried in thought. Over time, I began to piece together what had happened. Loose conversations with nurses, papers forgotten on the bench, phrases picked up in the corridor. My accident had been bad. A high-speed collision on an isolated highway. According to the doctors, it was a miracle that I was still breathing. But for my parents, it seemed, the miracle was a nuisance, a mistake. The life insurance policy they had taken out on me years before, as part of a family policy of financial protection, finally seemed to have a practical use. With me unconscious, with a reserved diagnosis and little chance of recovery, all it took was a document, a signature, and the money would be released. Money that, as far as I understood, had already begun to change hands. Nobody explained anything to me officially. They didn't even bother to disguise the frequent visits from the lawyers, the hastily signed papers, the anxious conversations in the corridor about suing the insurance company and guaranteeing maximum compensation. I was a ghost trapped inside my own skin, listening to my own story being sold like cheap merchandise. To my parents, I was no longer a person. The days blended together like spilled ink. Light poured in and out of the hospital's narrow windows without me being able to keep up. Sometimes I woke up feeling like hours had passed. Other times it seemed like the last blink had lasted an eternity. The only constant was the emptiness that accumulated around me, a heavy silence that was hard to ignore. At some point, I began to notice the changes, small ones at first, almost imperceptible. A wall clock that disappeared from the room. The change from a whiteboard with medical notes to a generic board, as if there was no longer any need for long-term plans. New nurses, with indifferent faces, who only came in to adjust machines or administer medication without even looking at me. They no longer called me by name. They no longer spoke to me. The routine went on as if I were part of the furniture, something they needed to keep working until a different order was given. I spent days trying to count how many times my mother or father would show up again. No visits, no questions in the corridors, no concern about whether the child they had raised, fed, and kissed on the forehead so many nights was still struggling to stay alive. What had once seemed like abandonment took on a new color, a kind of disguised disdain, an invisible rush for my story to end soon and for them to move on. One morning, I overheard a conversation in the corridor. Nurses discussing the legal procedures for removing life support in irreversible cases. One of them mentioned my bed number with the coldness of someone talking about a piece of furniture that is going to be discarded. I stood there, unable to react, unable to protest, feeling my skin break out in a cold sweat, my heart beating so loudly that it drowned out the rest of my words. The fear wasn't of dying. It was of being erased, as if I had never existed. I began to observe everything with the eyes of someone who already knew that time was running out on me. The rare visits from older doctors who seemed less interested in studying my case than in confirming a withdrawal certificate. The papers coming in and out of the legal department. The furtive glances from the staff, as if everyone already knew that there was no point in bonding with someone who wouldn't be there anytime soon. My body was still fighting, but it was a silent war, waged in invisible trenches. Every beat of my heart felt like a challenge thrown into the void, a stubborn refusal to be buried alive. One afternoon, as the sunlight seeped through the blinds, a younger nurse, recently transferred, approached to change the bed sheets. She was humming softly, distracted. When she saw me blink, an almost imperceptible gesture, she dropped the tray on the floor with a thud. She looked at me as if she had seen a ghost. For a brief moment, our worlds touched. He ran to get a doctor. 2 more were called. They came running with devices, tests, emergency examinations. The room became a hurricane of hurried movements, needles, bright lights, questions I couldn't answer. They analyzed reflexes, tried to decipher signs. Even so, the diagnosis was dry and cruel. Persistent vegetative state. The words sounded like a final verdict. Vegetative. Persistent. It didn't matter what I felt inside. It didn't matter to anyone that my mind screamed for help every day. To them, I was a piece of flesh, breathing stubbornly. A few weeks later, I overheard a doctor talking to someone on the phone. She spoke quietly, but the thin walls of the hospital let loose words. The insurance has already been released. The payment has been made into the parent's account. The legal death certificate has been issued on the basis of the irreversible condition. I couldn't breathe properly. My mouth went dry. My stomach turned into a tight knot. Legal death. They signed off on my death while I was still breathing, still feeling, still wanting to fight. They sold me like someone disposing of something too old to repair. With every breath, I felt the crushing weight of reality building up in my lungs. They weren't waiting for me to die. They had decided that I was already dead, and they were spending my last breath as if it were a consolation prize. The urge to cry consumed me, but the body, a traitor, allowed no relief. I stayed there, trapped in a coffin of bones and skin, listening to my own absence being celebrated with bank statements and new promises of an easy life. If fate had been fair, it would have taken me at once, but it seemed to prefer the slow punishment, the cruel irony of keeping me alive just to watch my own funeral take place without flowers, without tears, without even a word of longing. The anger grew slowly, seeping through the cracks in my soul like a leak that you pretend you don't see until the whole wall collapses. I decided I wouldn't die for them. The hours in the hospital became an amorphous time, with no defined contours. Light and darkness took turns outside the dirty windows, but inside it seemed that time didn't pass. It just dragged on, heavy as fresh cement. The routine was predictable. Nurses changed the IVs, doctors filled out soulless reports, machines beeped in a rhythm that was already part of my breathing. If I'd still had the strength, I would have screamed. I would have ripped out the threads stuck in my skin and walked to wherever those who signed my sentence were. But my once firm muscles were now nothing more than memories. The only rebellion I had left was my stubborn conscience, standing firm like a beacon in the middle of a sea of oblivion. Over time, the clues to what was really happening around me began to become impossible to ignore. Letters left on the table, murmured conversations at shift changes, flash visits from suits who never looked at the bed, people who came to settle details, stamp papers, close accounts. It was obvious. For them, I was just a piece of data on file, a CPF downloaded into the system, a body that took up space. One sultry Friday afternoon, when the smell of disinfectant seemed even stronger than usual, I heard a voice I didn't recognize, a man talking to the head of nursing in a hurried tone. He was saying something about a transfer, a new nursing home. There, he said, I would receive proper palliative care. Translated into less bureaucratic language, I would be deposited in a moribund warehouse. The news didn't cause me immediate anger. It was a heavy resignation, a weariness greater than any indignation. They were getting rid of me in the same way that you uproot an old piece of furniture to make room for something nicer. It took another 2 weeks to formalize the transfer. During this time, I saw discreet movements in the hospital, documents being signed without ceremony, boxes being sealed, personal belongings that I didn't even know were there being catalogued as evidence of a closed process. Deep down, I began to understand that this was also a form of death, a slow death, without the right to awake or mourning, dying socially before really dying. The day they came to pick me up, the nurse pushing my stretcher looked at the floor, avoiding any eye contact. The ambulance driver only confirmed my name and covered me with a sheet up to my neck, like someone preparing a fragile package. No relatives accompanied me, no goodbye. I got into the vehicle with my heart pounding loudly in my ribs, as if trying to fight its way out. The journey to my new home took little more than 40 minutes, but seemed to drag on for a lifetime. The building was gray, old, with small windows and cracks in the walls. A lady in a dirty coat greeted us at the gate, without asking anything. They put my stretcher in a shared room next to 3 other immobile bodies, all breathing in an almost synchronized rhythm of defeat. The smell of mold and expired medication permeated my nostrils at the first breath. I heard hoarse coughs through the corridors, muffled moans that seemed to echo through the structure like ancient laments. There, in that place where hope came to die slowly, I began to sketch the only possible escape. I didn't know how. I didn't know if it was feasible, but I knew that staying there, waiting for the body to give in, was the real death sentence. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday morning. A younger nurse, probably newly hired, had forgotten my chart open on the table while she was adjusting the pillows. With superhuman effort, I forced my eyes to focus on the fine print. There was my full name, and below it, a clinical note. Patient transferred under authorization of legal guardians. Vegetative state. Symbolic death certificate issued on June 12th. Symbolic death. It had become a formality, a number to close administrative files. Indignation throbbed in my temples, but this time it wasn't mixed with sadness. It was at that moment that I decided they wouldn't have the last word. At each doctor's visit, I began to rehearse small movements. First, I tried to move the little finger on my left hand. Then the right eyelid. Sometimes I succeeded. Sometimes my body betrayed me. It was a brutal, frustrating process, but each small success was a spark in a place where even the air seemed extinguished. Without the doctors noticing, I was building inch by inch the first real rebellion against the fate they had written for me. The asylum system was flawed. Few nurses, even less supervision. At night, the corridors were practically deserted, and the security guard slept against the back door. I observed their routine like someone observing the movement of an enemy city before an attack. I didn't have a clear plan yet. All I knew was that if I stayed there, it would only be a matter of time before my body gave out for good. And they finally had the comfortable ending they had planned. While the world thought I was dead, I used every second hiding in the shadows to prove that there was still something alive in here. The asylum smelled of oblivion. The peeling walls seemed to carry echoes of unfulfilled promises, of stories finished before their time. Lying in that narrow bed, I could feel the dust piling up on me, as if every speck was another attempt by the world to bury me for good. Every night was a battle. My head buzzed with thoughts, improvised plans that were born and died at the same speed as hope threatened to evaporate. I learned to measure time not by clocks, but by the cycle of sounds in the building. Heavy footsteps at dusk, creaking food trolleys in the corridors, the heavy breathing of the other residents sunk in the same abandonment. I began to test my limits in secret. When everyone was asleep, I would force small contractions in my atrophied muscles, as if each tiny movement were a prayer said in the dark. One of the fingers on my right hand responded first. Then there was a slight tremor in my left foot. No one noticed. Nobody paid enough attention. Over the weeks, I managed to drag my hand to the edge of the sheet. It was such a small victory that I almost cried with frustration. But it was a start. It was more than they thought I had left. In the third week, after observing all the shift changes, I noticed that during some early mornings, the asylum was completely left to its own devices. The security guard dozed in a chair near the side entrance. The nurses slipped into the restroom, confident that nothing new could happen in a place where everyone was practically dead. It was in this gap of carelessness that my escape would have to happen. I planned it like someone plans a jump without a net. Every detail mattered. The right moment, the shortest route to the door, how to avoid alarms or interventions. The chance of success was minimal, but waiting for help that would never come was certain death. On the chosen night, the cold cut through the room with a damp wind that came through the poorly sealed windows. I waited until the last light went out in the corridor. Forcing every fiber of my body, I moved my arm until I reached the side rail of the bed. My fingers were shaking so badly that I could barely get a firm grip. I pushed with what little strength I had left, letting my body slide slowly towards the edge. When I finally touched the floor with my right foot, the pain shot through me like an electric shock. My legs, weak and disobedient, gave way, and I fell with a deafening thud. The impact knocked the air out of my lungs, but I gritted my teeth and remained motionless for a few seconds, listening carefully for any sign of alarm. Nothing. I began to crawl. The grimy vinyl floor scraped my skin, and every movement was a desperate effort against gravity, against pain, against giving up. 1,000 times my body begged me to stop. 1,000 times I ignored it. I reached the bedroom door, after what seemed like hours. The corridor, lit by dead white bulbs, stretched out in front of me like an endless desert. I needed to cross it to the back area, where I knew there was an emergency door that was rarely locked. I pushed my body with what was left of my energy, inch by inch, leaving an invisible trail of stubbornness behind me. Halfway there, a whispered voice made me freeze. Two nurses, returning from the restroom. I pressed my face against the floor, holding my breath, trying to make myself disappear. They walked past me without noticing. They were talking about clothes on sale and TV series. They laughed. When the voices faded into the distance, I carried on. I reached the emergency door on the basis of my last reserves of strength. My trembling hands reached for the handle, but they were so weak that I had to lean on my shoulder to push. The door creaked low, a sound that seemed deafening in the dead silence of the early morning. The cold street air hit my face like a slap. The city outside was a different world. Lights flashing, cars passing in the distance, life pulsing like a promise. Everything I had been banished from like an invisible exile. I crawled out onto the sidewalk, where I hid behind a pile of garbage bags. There I stood, panting, unable to move another muscle, but alive. More alive than I'd ever been allowed to be since the day of the accident. The sky was gray at dawn when a can collector found me. When he saw me, his eyes were a mixture of fright and pity. Carefully, he called the emergency services. He spoke of an abandoned man, almost dead, found on a forgotten street in the city. The ambulance took a while, but arrived. The young paramedic looked at me with wide eyes. "How are you still breathing?" I tried to smile, but my body wouldn't let me. At the hospital, while they rehydrated me and carried out tests, the truth began to come out of the corners where it had been hidden. My name was no longer on the regular systems. It was listed as deceased. It took me hours to be able to make intelligible sounds. It took days to convince someone that it wasn't a database error or a hallucination. When the social worker finally came to talk to me, her expression was a mixture of incredulity and horror. She promised that she would make sure that the authorities were informed. She promised that my rights would be restored. But part of me knew that this was only the beginning. The hospital where I was taken was small, far from the big centers where bureaucracy runs faster than life. Maybe that's why I had time. Time to rebuild myself. Time to make the people there believe in me. With effort and daily sessions of painful physiotherapy, I won the right to partially move my arms and articulate enough words to defend myself. At first, the doctors treated my case as an anomaly, a statistical error. They didn't question how someone declared dead could appear there, dragging a living shadow down the corridor, struggling to be heard. It was easier to fill in reports and whisper in the corridors about a miracle than to confront the system that had allowed me to be discarded. The social worker, Donna Elisa, was the first to look at me without the expression of someone who sees an inconvenient problem. Too old to fear prosecution, too stubborn to accept injustice, she embraced my cause with a determination that I no longer knew existed in the world. Together, we began the process of reversing my death. Hours in queues at public offices, documents demanding explanations that I didn't have the strength to offer. Each new stage seemed to build an even higher wall between me and the life that had been snatched from me. Signatures denied, suspicious looks, systems that crashed when trying to insert a dead person back into the database of the living. Even in the face of all this, something inside me wouldn't let me back down. As I fought behind the scenes to officially reclaim my name, my mind wandered to the possibilities. What would happen when I officially came back into existence? What would I have left besides a history of abandonment and a body drained of vigor? Donna Elisa was practical. She didn't promise happy endings. She warned that even if I succeeded, I might have to go through lengthy processes to recover documents, prove my identity, perhaps even fight for every basic right that anyone took for granted. I accepted everything, without any illusions. After months of paperwork, expert opinions, and administrative hearings, the day came for the judicial reassessment. Sitting in an uncomfortable wheelchair, Waiting to be called, I felt the weight of the stares of the other applicants. Tired people, invisible people like me, piled up in corridors, suffocated by heat and neglect. When they called my name, my real name, something inside me vibrated. It was faint, but it was real. The judge, a middle-aged man with a tired expression and a crooked tie, read the case with visible disinterest. He repeated data, questioned facts. When he understood the situation, he raised an eyebrow and asked if I had anything to say. His voice came out hoarse, tearing his throat. I'm alive. Nothing more, nothing less. The silence that followed that sentence seemed to weigh tons. He signed the papers. He gave me back my legal existence like someone stamping a lost package. Outside the courthouse, Donna Elisa celebrated with a discreet smile. We knew that the biggest battle was yet to come. Regaining civil rights was one part of it, but the people who erased me, they were still free, living without any consequences. I didn't look for my parents immediately. Part of me wanted revenge. Another part, perhaps the part that hadn't completely died yet, wanted to understand. When I finally managed to find out where they lived, a new house in a luxury condominium, bought with part of the insurance they had received, I spent 3 nights watching from afar. They were happy, or they pretended to be. My father mowed the lawn with a modern machine. My mother went out with bags of shopping. Easy smiles, peaceful lives. No one seemed to carry the weight of having buried a child alive. I could have invaded their world with lawsuits, public scandals, and open accusations, but I realized that that would be giving them more importance than they deserved. Instead, I filed a detailed police report, handed over the evidence I had, medical reports, insurance transfers, false death records, and let the system take its course. No anger, no rush. They would have to face up to what they had ignored. But I wouldn't have to get my hands dirty for that. Over the next few months, I rebuilt what I could. A small welfare pension, a free rehabilitation program. Good people came along the way without asking for anything in return. Living became something else. It was no longer about big dreams or epic achievements. It was about existing in a dignified way, breathing without fear, waking up without the weight of having to prove to the world that I deserved to be there. I never saw my parents in person again. I received sparse news through lawyers, accounts blocked, investigations opened, threats of bankruptcy. Today, sitting in my small rented room, surrounded by plants growing slowly in makeshift pots, I think that maybe that's what life is all about. Surviving the collapses and learning to find beauty in every fragment that remains. I'm not their son anymore. I was never the miracle that the doctors preferred to call themselves, so as not to admit their mistakes. I'm just a man who refused the fate they gave him. And that in itself is much more than they expected of me. And if you think I was man enough, don't forget to let me know what you think in the comments. And if you liked this video, leave a like.